So if you've watched my channel recently, you probably look at my bookshelves. Everyone looks at bookshelves in the back of BookTube videos, and seen that I have this history section right here. But I don't maybe talk about the history books I read as much as obviously my sci-fi fantasy. So I thought I'd make a video about that. This year I read 8 biographies of the first 8 US presidents, and I'm going to talk about those books. So you may or may not know that my real job when I'm not making BookTube videos is a politician. I serve in the Minnesota House of Representatives as a state representative here in Minnesota, representing Rochester, Minnesota. And so I obviously have an interest in politics, and that leads to an interest in history. And obviously as a reader, I enjoy both of those things. So I read biographies and history works and nonfiction works all the time, and so now I'm going to talk about them. With the current occupant of the White House, who I disagree with vehemently on basically every topic, I thought I would examine the presidency by reading a biography, making the goal of reading one biography of every U.S. president during his second term. This first year, I've gone through 8. If you've ever read a biography of a president, you know they can be pretty big and thick, so it's taken some time with some bumps on the way, but let's talk about those books. So first, a book I read about George Washington. It's right here. His Excellency George Washington by Joseph Ellis. As you can probably guess, because I actually own the physical copy and I have kept it, I really enjoyed this book. I think this is one of the best presidential biographies I have ever read. It is very digestible. Even though it looks kind of thick, it's under 400 pages. I think it's like 350, maybe even a little less. Yeah, it's like at 300. But in that, you get the whole character of George Washington and many of the major themes of his life, many of the major events of his life quickly. I would compare this really favorably to maybe a more famous book, Ron Chernow's Washington A Life, which I think is a little bit too meticulous in its details and is quite hard for anyone who doesn't love history to really get through the whole thing. Whereas this is great. If you're looking for a really great biography on George Washington, His Excellency George Washington, great, talks about the virtues of the man, but also does, especially towards the end of Washington's life, spend a lot of time talking about Washington, the slave owner, which is an important part of his legacy. I highly would recommend this work. Very digestible. Almost immediately after that, I read John Ferling's John Adams' A Life. Now, this is a much more academic work, and it purposefully presents itself as such. A lot of footnotes and footnotes to things like quarterlies and primary source documents, and certainly a lot of the diaries of John Adams. So it is quite dull. I'm just going to be honest with you right now. It's nothing like the book I just said. It is not a popular work. This is for academics. So in that sense, most people who are listening to this, you probably should not read. I would recommend John Adams by David McCullough is a much more accessible read for those who just want to learn about John Adams, the man. But someone who wants to go a little deeper into the context of a lot of things, particularly his work as a diplomat and his work on the Declaration of Independence, which is my favorite chapter in this book, I would recommend this. I still have it because it's a good reference material, but again, not like a crazy amazing novel. Yeah. But I enjoyed Joseph J. Ellis so much with George Washington, I thought I would read his book on Thomas Jefferson next, which is titled American Sphinx. And this, again, is a phenomenal book. I had not read any Ellis before I read these 2 books, and I am now a huge fan. And when I'm done with this series, I will read the other books that he has written because I just think he's a fantastic historian. It's interesting when you read these biographies, there's always this tension between trying to just tell the facts, well, this is true of all history, telling the facts and also interpreting them to make them meaningful in the present, right? It would be historically accurate to go over every single meal that Thomas Jefferson ever ate, but that wouldn't be a very meaningful book. And so any work of history has to tell the facts, but also make them meaningful. And Ellis is so good at that. And especially with Jefferson, who's such an enigma. This man who primarily wrote the Declaration of Independence, which before the ink was even dry was already a sounding board for oppressed peoples throughout the world, whether that is indigenous peoples in the country that was oppressing them actively, whether it was slave owners, slaves who were owned as people, whether it is women who immediately thought they should be able to vote, and has sounded through that through the ages. This man of freedom who also was a slave owner and formed the early United States federal government to not interfere with states who wanted to continue in this economy of free labor and this great sin of America's youth. It's just, you have to take this man as a whole, and I think Ellis does a great job of that. American Sphinx is the best Jefferson biography I've read that doesn't lionize this man, but also doesn't downplay what he meant for like liberalism as like an idea, republicanism as an idea in our world. Highly would recommend American Sphinx by Joseph J. Ellis. James Madison. Let me let you in on a secret here. I think James Madison is kind of boring. He's obviously brilliant, father of the Constitution. He was sort of the man who brought Jefferson's ideas into the actual world and actually made the politics work for Jefferson's like Revolution of 1800. And a lot of stuff that's ascribed to Jefferson only happened because Madison was sort of making it happen in the world. But he's just not that interesting of a guy, to be honest. And so I read a shorter biography of him by Richard Brookhiser, which is interesting. He's a conservative columnist. I think he wrote or currently writes for National Review. Obviously, I'm not of that persuasion. So kind of going in here a little trepidatious, but honestly, it's pretty straightforward. This is what his life is. This is what he did. Some major chapters focusing on his work in the Constitution and the Federalist Papers. His presidency, some of the failures of his tariff policy and anti-bank policy in the War of 1812, and his political sort of genius of being the first one to sort of use these political machines. So again, this book, whatever. But honestly, the man is kind of whatever, so that's just, I don't know, that's probably a hot take, but Madison has never really drawn me as some of these other men do. And that's a fun transition because my biggest surprise so far in these books has been James Monroe. I read James Monroe, A Life by Tim McGrath, which is a big, thick book. Took a long time to get through. I listened to it in audiobook and read some in the physical book. It is way too thorough as a biography, in my opinion, but I didn't really know very much about James Monroe, so I enjoyed still reading this and finding out about the man, and he is fascinating. As boring as Madison is, to me, Monroe is fascinating. He's sort of like the Forrest Gump of the Founding Fathers. He doesn't have any like token thing he did. He didn't write the Declaration of Independence. He wasn't the ambassador for the Treaty of Paris. He wasn't, didn't lead the Continental Congress. He doesn't have like the things, but he's there basically all the time. He is injured at the Battle of Trenton, sort of the biggest victory in the early parts of the war led by George Washington. He serves in the Virginia House of Delegates as well as becomes the governor. He is overseas as a diplomat in England and in Europe while maintaining or starting this new nation. He's basically the driving force of the war effort during the War of 1812. I mean, he's always there. He's one of the people in the room where it happens in Hamilton, right? He knows about the Reynolds affair. He almost gets into a duel with Alexander Hamilton off of that. He served in the House. He served in the Senate. Like, he's just all over the place. And much more so than, Washington, Jefferson, and Madison are all like rich. They come from rich landowner owners in Virginia, like gentleman society. Monroe comes from Virginia, but his dad dies very early on, and basically the fortune that his family has goes away, and he's much more of a self-made man than all of those others. And what people keep talking about is he has this great judgment. And his presidency is so interesting because it's called the Era of Good Feelings. He basically, for just a time in his own presidency, puts an end to the party system, being the Federalists and the Republicans that have been happening for a long time. It's revived very quickly in Jacksonian and Van Buren times, but I just think that's fascinating, and the work is good. So it is overly thorough, but I do think if you want to know more about Monroe, it's a good biography to read. Next, I read A Militant Spirit, a John Quincy Adams biography by Traub. What's his first name? James Traub. This is almost the exact same as I just said about McGrath's book on Monroe. It is thick, it is huge, it is overly detailed, took me forever to get through, but I didn't know much about John Quincy Adams, and it was a fascinating read. And John Quincy Adams, speaking of slavery, was one of the first 10 presidents who did not own fellow human beings. His father, John Adams, was the only other one. And his journey from early diplomat, like literally from when I think he was 12, his father took him over to Russia and France and the Netherlands. Like he works in the Foreign Service. He basically helps to build up America's Foreign Service. He serves as the minister to England. Then he shifts to national politics, eventually rising all the way to president. One of the few Northerners who, or not one of the few, but he's one of the first Northerners to switch parties from Federalists into Republicans, and then becomes president because of a shrewd deal after having a really strong partnership with James Monroe, and then ultimately falls victim to Jacksonian democracy with Andrew Jackson's rise to power. But even in that time, then he goes back and serves in the U.S. House of Representatives until he passes away, and in all that time battles to abolish slavery. And it's a really fascinating man, fascinating story. He is a man of iron, not a lot of heart and feeling, and he treated his family quite poorly because of that, like his own father, honestly, in some ways, but also had rigid morals, and that really shone, and historically, I think, shines brightly. So fascinating man. The book was a little long and tedious. Life of Andrew Jackson was a much shorter book by Rimini. Is that who it is? Yeah, Robert Rimini. It's like an abridged version of like a 3-volume work on Jackson, and it was actually written, I believe, in the 70s and 80s. So this is not as, what's the word I want to use here? Reflective on the vices of Jackson. And still, this book is quite critical of Jackson's westward expansion ideology, how he treated the sovereign tribes here in the United States, the sort of setting the stage for oppression of the American Indians that had already been taking place, of course, for hundreds of years, but got much worse under Andrew Jackson and would continue to get worse as the United States continued its westward expansion, but also investigated how Jackson changed the presidency in his time and how he viewed things differently and how he did truly expand democracy as a concept in the United States at the same time. So another complicated historical figure, as they all are, but I quite enjoyed this work. If you're looking for a good Jackson book, I would recommend, what's the actual title? Let's see here. The Life of Andrew Jackson, Not Too Creative, by Robert Rimini. The final book, I have it, I should go get it, hold on. This book about Martin Van Buren, the magician, called Martin Van Buren and the Making of the American Political System by Cole is his last name. What's his first name? Donald B. Cole. This is another academic work. This is meant for academics. It is highly footnoted, highly researched, and very thorough. And in that realm, it's a good book. And it's actually written quite well for an academic work, but certainly not a digestible read of Martin Van Buren. But honestly, I didn't know much about Van Buren, and so I was happy to get sort of the amount of information I got out of this. Our 8th president, and as I said, Jason Monroe sort of brought a close to political parties, or tried to, and Van Buren really successfully built up a political machine and brought back the party system to help first Andrew Jackson really establish power, but then ultimately himself for 4 years. But unfortunately, while doing that, sacrificed, I think, a lot of morals, because he resurrected the Republican Party that defended slavery and even defended it during westward expansion. So complicated, to say the least, but I didn't know much about, and now I know a lot more about, so I really enjoyed that. That's what historical books are for. There we go. Those are the 8 biographies on presidents that I read this year. If you're out there and you're just like looking for like a fun history book to learn something you haven't, Joseph J. Ellis, from this video, I hope you take away. You should check out his writing. His biography on George Washington and Thomas Jefferson are both excellent, very digestible. I would highly recommend them. Have you read any history books? Any questions about other history books that you should read or not read? Let me know in the comments. I have no idea how this video is going to do. Maybe no one's watching this. I don't know. Who knows? As always, first in, last out.